Good evening, everyone, and welcome to This Can Happen, a credible case for feeling good about the future, and lesson number 5, Out of the Blues. This Can Happen is dedicated by Arlene in loving memory of her children, Jody Sue Dombeck of blessed memory, and Michael Scott Dombeck of blessed memory. May the learning be a comfort for their soul and cause an elevation for their soul. So last week, we continued our discussion about the Messianic era. Now, the very purpose of the creation of the world is to bring about the Messianic era. And we explained some of the theological principles behind it, which our job is to fulfill God's desire, which is to create a home for him in the lowest possible world. The lowest possible world means in a place where God is the most concealed. When we find him, when we search for him, when we discover him, and make the presence of God natural, normal, obvious, and comfortable, then that is fulfilling the purpose of creation, and that will usher in the Messianic era. The focus in last week's lesson were to explore 4 major elements in Jewish history, and through the lens of those 4, we got an appreciation for all of the ups and downs within history have actually been moving us closer to that final destination, to the Messianic era. And in fact, the period that we're in right now allows us to do the most meaningful, the most important, and the most critical work, because currently in exile, we have no temple, we don't have a prophet, right? We don't have miracles, we don't have any of that stuff. So you could say that today we're perhaps in an era where God is concealed the most, yet we are doing the most, right? We're doing the most to create a world that is worthy of the divine presence and worthy of the Messianic era. And of course, it is all created by us. The question for today is, how exactly will the Messianic era unfold? And who is this person that we keep talking about that's going to be Mashiach? Now, the first thing that comes to mind when we think about the Messianic era is miracles. We're talking about a time where there's going to be an end to hunger, an end to poverty, an end to violence, and so on. This sounds quite miraculous. I don't know if food is going to be, there's going to be money growing on trees and so on. We can imagine in our mind the lion is laying with the lamb. We're talking about a miraculous time. But let's actually look at the sources. What does the Torah have to say about the way that the Messianic era is going to unfold? So we're going to do 5 texts in rapid order without any commentary on them. Text 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we'll discuss. So Vivian, could you please read text number 1 on page 196?
A sudden appearance. Behold, I will send my angel, and he will clear a way before me. And suddenly the God whom you seek shall come to his temple.
Right, that's text number 1. Keep in mind what picture of the Messianic era is being depicted. Text number 2, Brad or Marilyn, please.
We don't have our book. We're sorry, Rabbi.
Oh, okay. All right, Irv, do you have your book? Are you able to unmute yourself, Irv? Do you have your book? All right, we can get back to you then, Irv. All right, Mitchell or Arlene, would you like to read text number 2 on page 197?
When a mortal monarch plans to return to his home, it is typical protocol for his arrival to be announced in advance. An initial announcement may give notice that he will arrive in 10 days, followed perhaps by the second advisory 5 days in advance, and then 4 days until the final proclamation the king is approaching the capital. The prophet Isaiah informed us that the Jewish redemption will not unfold in this manner. Rather, it will arrive in the blink of an eye, as he foretold. The first one to Zion, behold, here they are, and for Jerusalem I will give a herald. In other words, Jerusalem's residents will not notice that all the tribes of Israel are converging on their city before the initial announcement is made by the first individual to reach Jerusalem. Will call out, look, here they all are about to enter the city. It will be so sudden that the city's residents will not notice a thing before the reality materializes. The announcement and the event will come as one. hence the initial notice. For Jerusalem, I will give a herald. Will be, behold, here they are.
All right, think about for a moment what this text tells us about the way that the Messianic era will arrive. Text number 3. Debbie, are you available to read text number 3?
Yes.
Excellent.
Okay. When God will raise up the people of Israel and redeem them from this exile, he will open a small, thin ray of light for them. Thereafter, he will open another, a far wider aperture. Finally, God will throw open the supernal gates that open to all 4 corners of the universe.
Right, thank you. Nathan, can you please read text number 4?
Okay.
Page 200. We can't hear you. You're unmuted, but we can't hear you. Can you try talking from, I don't know, we can't hear you. All right, I'm not sure what's going on. We can't hear you for the moment. We can try and come back to you again to see if that changes. All right, Phil, would you like to read text number 4?
Okay, excuse me. The Jewish people of that generation will say, is it possible that the world functions as usual and nevertheless the redemption will arrive this year? However, they do not realize that Mashiach's arrival will be sudden.
All right, thank you. Again, think again what this text is telling us. Now, Nathan, did your microphone go back on there for a second?
I think it may have.
You're on, absolutely. All right, text number 5, please.
Okay, this is from the Jerusalem Talmud in Brachos. Rabbi Chia Ba'arba and Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafsa once walked through the Arbel Valley and watched the break of dawn. Whereupon Rabbi Chia told Rabbi Shimon, quote, "So will be the Jewish redemption. It will begin with small steps, as it is stated, although I will sit in darkness, God will be a light to me," from Micha. Then as it progresses, it will greatly swell and expand.
Right, we've just read through 5 texts that painted various pictures about how the Messianic era will unfold. My question for you is, based on these 5 texts, is the Messianic era going to arrive in a sudden and miraculous nature, or is it going to be a gradual process that follows more along the rules of nature? Any thoughts or ideas based on the text that you just read?
It will happen suddenly, and there that Mashiach will be here.
We definitely had some texts that describe the coming of Mashiach as something very sudden. Any other insights that you might have picked up that paint slightly a different picture? Especially text number 5, text number 3 seem to imply that it's successive, it's gradual, there's a process, it goes step by step. So we seem to have Jewish sources that point in both directions. Which one is correct? Which one is accurate? Let's go to text number 6a and text number 6b for the resolution of this problem as discussed in the Talmud. Right, Vivian, are you still here? There you go. All right, Vivian, please. You jumped around on my screen. Text 6a and 6b.
Hastening its time. The smallest will become 1,000 and the least a mighty nation. I am God, I will hasten it in its time. The merit factor. The same verse that states that the redemption will arrive in its time also states, I will hasten it. Is there a set time for the redemption or not? The Talmud resolves this seeming contradiction. If they merit, I will hasten it. If they do not merit, it will occur only when its time arrives.
So the Talmud resolves this conflicting pieces of information that we find in Jewish literature by telling us that there are 2 ways, 2 possibilities that the Messianic era unfold. One is sudden. If we are meritorious, if we deserve it, if we somehow have done that mitzvah that tips the scale, Mashiach can come in one moment, in 1 second. Miraculous in nature, a temple descending from the heavens. That is option number one. Mashiach can be a sudden, miraculous transformation. However, if we are not meritorious, in the sense that we did not do something that would merit the miraculous and immediate coming of Mashiach, it could be a much more gradual process that follows the laws of nature, where the world steadily improves over a period of time in the physical and spiritual sense, until you look around you and you're like, we're in the Messianic era. And it actually unfolds as the prophecies describe, but progressively, slowly, step after step. So there are two options of how the Messianic era could unfold. Now, the Messianic era is going to be ushered in by a human leader, the person who is Mashiach. But Jewish tradition tells us that before Mashiach comes, there is somebody else that's going to come. Text number 7. Mitchell or Arlene, would you like to read text number 7, please? Yep.
All right, the announcer. I will send Elijah the prophet to you before the arrival of the day of God.
So we are told that the prophet Eliyahu is going to arrive before Mashiach and is going to herald the era of redemption. Now, who is Eliyahu? One of the most beloved and most famous Jewish prophets as described in the Tanakh. He lived in approximately 800 years before the Common Era. And the Torah tells us something about him that it does not say about any other person who has ever lived. And that his body ascended to heaven, not just his soul. So Eliyahu HaNavi is unique amongst all human beings, that he transformed his body to the extent that it was simply a manifestation and expression of his soul, and it ascended to heaven. He did not die the normal death. And we know, of course, he attends every Seder and he attends every bris as well. The prophet Malachi tells us that he will return before the Messianic era. Now, what is the function of Eliyahu HaNavi? So in your book, we have this in figure 5.1, but we have it on the PowerPoint as well. He's going to do 5 things. Number 1, he's going to announce Mashiach's imminent arrival. If you verify that a person who is announcing Mashiach's arrival is in fact Eliyahu HaNavi, Elijah the prophet, that's good news, right? That's very good news. That's a good sign. Eliyahu is going to play the role of a prophet. What is the role of a prophet? To inspire Israel to better their ways. Just as the prophets did to the Jews, like 2,000, 3,000 years ago in the land of Israel, so too Eliyahu will be there to inspire Israel to better their ways. Number 3, he's going to restore prophecy, right? Prophecy is a big part of what the Messianic era is all about. The Messianic era is about divine communication, knowledge of God. Prophecy is a part of that. So with Eliyahu HaNavi, prophecy will return, a spiritual awakening, a tangible and concrete spiritual awakening as manifest in restoring prophecy. He will answer unresolved halachic queries. The Talmud is full of Talmudic debates. Generally speaking, they are resolved. There's a conclusion. However, from time to time in the Talmud, they say, we don't know. We have not been able to come down on one side or the other. The job of Eliyahu HaNavi will be to resolve these halachic disputes. And finally, to restore the Sanhedrin, right? The Sanhedrin is the main supreme rabbinic court. 40 years before the temple was destroyed, it ceased to function. With the return of Eliyahu HaNavi, he will restore it. One of the reasons that he's going to be able to restore it is, in order to serve on the Sanhedrin, you have to have rabbinic ordination in a direct line from Moshe himself. Now, this is so important that when there were enemies of the Jewish people who sought to harm the Jewish people in the greatest way possible, they attempted to wipe out any rabbis who had rabbinic ordination going back to Moshe. So what is Eliyahu Hanavi going to do? Eliyahu Hanavi did not die. Eliyahu Hanavi represents a person living who has rabbinic ordination going back directly from Moshe, and he will be able to give that level of rabbinic ordination, and the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, will return. So Eliyahu Hanavi is very much associated with the Messianic era, so much so that we got this beautiful illustrated Haggadah. This Haggadah, if I'm not mistaken, is from the year 1560, something along those, yes, 1560 from the Braginsky collection. And in the drawing there's Eliyahu Hanavi blowing the shofar of redemption. Who is he behind? Mashiach, right? One of the ways that Mashiach is depicted is riding on a donkey. So here you have a beautiful depiction of Eliyahu Hanavi who's blowing the shofar, heralding the coming of Mashiach, before Mashiach riding there on the donkey. Okay, so we talked about the two different methods of the arrival of Mashiach. It could happen suddenly in a miraculous fashion, or it can happen gradually, more according to the laws of nature, depending whether we are deserving for a miraculous and instant Mashiach, or one that takes a little bit more time. Now we have to get to the question of who is Mashiach, right? We talked a lot about the Messianic era, but who exactly is the person who's going to be Mashiach? Text number 8. Nathan, would you like to read text number 8?
This is from Rabbi Chaim Vital. King Mashiach will certainly be a righteous human born of a man and a woman.
So we see black and white, very clear. King Mashiach will be a human being. And we did not even have to go to a Kabbalistic source. This is pretty much Judaism 101. Mashiach is going to be a physical person that was born of a father and a mother, just like anyone else. Right, so that is requirement number 1. Mashiach is going to be a human being. Now, what qualities does this human being have? What are the traits that we're looking for in a potential candidate to be Mashiach? Let's go to text number 10. Irv, are you able to read text number 10? We're skipping 9. We're going to text number 10 on page 208. You got to unmute yourself. There you go.
Did that do it?
Yep, that did it.
Okay.
We got you.
The King Mashiach who will arise from David's descendants will be wiser than Solomon and a great prophet, close to the level of Moses. He will therefore teach the entire nation and instruct them in the path of God, and all the nations will come to hear his words.
So we are told here by the Rambam that King Mashiach will be the greatest and the wisest. So we know Jewish tradition tells us that Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, was the wisest of all people. Mashiach will be wiser. Mashiach is going to be a great prophet, almost to the level of Moshe. Moshe is the greatest prophet ever. He spoke to God face to face. He went up to Mount Sinai, right? He received the Torah. So Mashiach is going to be smarter than Moses, prophetic ability almost the same like Moshe. He's going to be a great teacher. So we're talking about a person who is a Torah scholar and who is a tzaddik. Any candidate who would make any claim to the messianic role would have to be a prophet, a scholar, a tzaddik of the highest caliber that you could possibly imagine. Let's go to text number 11. Debbie, please.
Okay. Mashiach's uniqueness will be his humility. Despite reaching the pinnacle of greatness, due to which he will teach Torah to the patriarchs and to Moses, he will nevertheless achieve the ultimate in humility and self-nullification, due to which he will also teach the simplest folk.
So when we talk about Mashiach being the greatest, the tzaddik, a prophet, the wisest, this does not imply someone who is removed from the community, removed from society, who sits head and shoulders above us with great distance between us. That's not the case. As great as Mashiach is, his entire identity is given over to the people and will teach and interact and learn with the greatest of the greats and the most simple of the Jewish people. Now, Debbie, you asked a question in the text, in the chat. Would you be able to repeat the question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't want to slow you down, but I'm just trying to understand if he's supposed to, instruct the nations, right? And teach and reveal the greatness of God. How could that happen in a quick manner? I would think that would almost happen in a gradual manner, like what you were saying, whether it was going to happen in a quick manner or gradual.
It's difficult to really describe the
Yeah.
sudden manner
Yeah,
because it's miraculous, right?
Right.
It's a miraculous thing.
right.
The gradual nature, we could kind of picture in our mind the world evolving and becoming more refined and sensitive, the world making better choices, ultimately resulting in peace and prosperity, in heightened levels of spirituality that result in ultimately the Messianic era. And we will discuss that a little further today. When it comes to understanding the sudden arrival of Mashiach, it's much harder to comprehend because it quite simply is a miraculous thing. But you could imagine that if the third temple, right, literally descends from the heavens, right, and manifests itself on the Temple Mount, that's going to cause quite the stir. And the evidence and the proof of the truth of that is going to be quite radical, quite convincing, and quite overwhelming.
Mhm.
So the miraculous nature of the sudden arrival will take care of itself.
Right.
The details, I'd like to see it. And when it happens, if it happens, we'll get all the answers. We'll have all the answers to the questions.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, Irv.
Do we know if there are any descendants of Moshe Rabbeinu?
Well, to be a descendant of Moshe Rabbeinu is not important for becoming Mashiach. To be Mashiach, you have to be a descendant from King David.
Oh.
And yes, there are people who do know. The same way that people know that they're a Kohen or a Levi, there are people who know that they are a descendant of King David. There were various people throughout Jewish history who had that tradition, and they passed it on from generation to generation. My mother's family, right, has a tradition that they are from the tribe of David. They go back to the Maharal of Prague, right? The Maharal of Prague lived in the 16th century, not that long ago. And he had a tradition in his family going back that they went all the way from King David.
Oh my
So
goodness.
it's not that far-fetched. There are Jews throughout the world who do have a tradition that they came from the house of David. Another way to look at it is if a person actually does all the stuff that Mashiach is supposed to do, but they do not have a tradition necessarily that they came from the house of David, the fact that they did all the stuff that Mashiach would do is pretty much going to verify that they have the right lineage and ancestry for the job, or else they wouldn't have been able to do it. So there's kind of the proof that you might have, and then the proof being in the end result of the person actually being Mashiach. Now, so far we listed qualities like the wisest, a prophet, right? Humble, a person that's a tzaddik. What else might there be? Now, there are many other qualities that actually are listed within Tanakh of what the character of the person who would be Mashiach would have. However, there is a single quality, a spiritual quality, where all of the other qualities that Mashiach possesses will flow. So in order to understand this, we need a little bit of background. It's a little bit Kabbalistic, so I don't know if we'll understand it 100%, but I think that you'll get a feel and an idea of the spiritual nature and quality of Mashiach. So let's look at figure 5.3. Jewish tradition teaches that every person has 5 levels in their soul. The soul is made of 5 components. Level number 1 is called nefesh, that translates as vitality. It is the biological life of your soul. This is the difference between alive and dead. If something exists, that means there's a spark of God that gives it life. This is the nefesh component of the soul. The ruach component, translated as the spirit, is the emotional capacity of the soul. Other creatures have a nefesh, but do not have a ruach. A rock, for example, has a nefesh, it does not have a ruach. The human being has a ruach, which represents the emotional capabilities of the soul. Next, there's the neshama, often translated as the soul, represents the intellectual and capabilities of the soul. Next is the chaya, translated as life, that corresponds to the faith of the soul. One way of looking at it is, this is the subconscious of the soul. This is the part of the soul that remains connected to our bodies, but at the same time remains connected to our creator. Therefore, it can represent the part of ourself that has a deep and profound faith in Hashem, because God is its life and its source. And finally, we have the Yechida, right? The Yechida translates as the unity, the singularity. This corresponds to the very essence of the soul. It corresponds to the essence of the soul where we are truly one, united, and connected with Hashem. You may be familiar with the fact that in Yom Kippur, there are 5 prayers. On a regular day, 3 prayers. On a holiday, or on a Shabbos, there's 4 prayers. Each of these prayers corresponds to a different level of the soul. On Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, the essence of our soul is manifest and expressed where we are completely, totally one with God. Nothing can separate us from God. Therefore, our sins are forgiven. So here we have the 5 levels of the soul. There's, of course, a lot more to say about each of them. Now is not the time. What I want to focus on now is the 5th level of the soul, which Mashiach has a profound and unique relationship with. Text number 12. All right, who are we up to for text number 12? Phil, please. Text number 12, page 211.
Okay. Mashiach's fundamental quality is that the collective Yechida of the Jewish nation. For the mystics reveal that King David merited the collective soul dimension of Nefesh, Elijah merited the Ruach, Moses the Neshama, Adam the Chaya, and Mashiach will merit the Yechida. Of the 5 dimensions that each soul possesses, the lower 4, Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, and Chaya, are individualized rungs with particular features and functions. By contrast, the Yechida is the soul's singular, indivisible core. Just as this is true regarding each individual soul, its very essence is the Yechida. The same is true of the life force of all creation. That life force itself has a Yechida that is the very essence of the divine energy that causes it to exist. And this Yechida is abstract, defying every qualification of form. From this Yechida, all the individualized branches of divine energy necessary for creation emerge. Now, the Mashiach is associated with this collective Yechida, all of creation. This essential core energy is unlimited, not only in quantity, but in quality as well. It is entirely perfect and complete. Therefore, when this energy manifests in this world through Mashiach, everything will function at the highest and most perfect level. Now, I'm
not sure if this text needs any explanation because it was so clear, down to earth, and in everyday language. But just in case, we'll talk about it a little more detail. So in the text, it says that the Mashiach is the collective Yechida of the Jewish nation. Mashiach's soul embodies this Yechida. This special soul will descend onto him. What does all this stuff mean? I think it's very simple. The role and the job of Mashiach is to usher in the Messianic era, which will fulfill the purpose of creation. How can you do that? How can a person usher in an era which literally transforms the physical and the spiritual nature of the universe? How is it possible? The answer is because the purpose of the creation of the world is Mashiach. Therefore, the soul of Mashiach is going to embody the collective spiritual energy of the entire creation, which is the Yechidah. Right? To say that again, the purpose of the creation of the world is the Messianic era. How do you bring about the Messianic era? How do you literally transform the very physical nature of the world? The soul of Mashiach is going to be, right, the collective spiritual energy that gives life to the entirety of all creation. Right? This is powerful stuff. Mashiach is going to have the collective soul. Therefore, he is able to usher in the Messianic era, which results in the physical and the spiritual transformation of the entire world. Now, how is it going to take place? Let's go to text number 13, actually. Text number 13, Nathan, please.
Following in Moshe's path by Rabbi Moshe Sefer. Moses, the first Redeemer, reached the age of 80 years with no knowledge or intuition about his eventual role as the Redeemer of Israel. So will it be, God willing, with the future Redeemer. When the time comes, God will appear to him, and then the spirit of Mashiach, that until that moment was hidden on high, will descend upon him, similar to the experience of Moshe at the burning bush.
So for so many years, for 80 years, Moshe was Moshe. But at that point in time, he was not a prophet, right, who communicated to God. He was not the Redeemer of the Jewish people. He was a towering figure, a worthy figure who lived in Midian and was a shepherd. When the time came and he was found worthy, right, he was granted the spiritual energy necessary to lead the Jewish people out of Egypt. Similar to the person who will be Mashiach. The person who will be Mashiach may live for many, many decades on this earth as a towering spiritual figure, but not Mashiach. When the time comes and he is worthy, the soul of Mashiach will descend, and that will allow for the physical and the spiritual transformation to take place. So thus far, right, we have identified some of the qualities and character traits that a person would have to have in order to be Mashiach, including the unique soul that Mashiach will be granted in order to have the power, the spiritual power, to complete the mission. Now, how do we identify this? Are there, if a person claims to be Mashiach, is there some type of PCR test that you can take to verify the claim? Is it a rapid, right? Do you got to stick something up the nose? Does it go in a mouth swab? How can you confirm whether a person is Mashiach or not? Let's go to text number 14. Vivian, please.
When a king from the house of David will arise, who, like his ancestor David, diligently studies the Torah and observes its mitzvot as prescribed by the written law and the oral law, influences all of Israel to walk in the way of the Torah, rectifies the breaches in its observance, and wages God's battle, this person is presumed to be the Mashiach. If he succeeds in the above and he builds the temple in its place and gathers the dispersed of Israel, he is certainly the Mashiach.
In this text from the Rambam identifies two stages and how you'll be able to identify who the person of Mashiach is. So let's go through all of them. The first thing that he says is that Mashiach is a king from the house of David. Now, does it mean literally a king? Not necessarily, right? Currently, at this moment, we live outside the land of Israel. We do not have a monarchy, so it would be very difficult for the person to arise as a king. What it means as a king, the person is going to function as a great leader of the Jewish people, similar to how a king is going to be able to function. So that's step number one. Now we go to figure 5.4, which I have right here on the PowerPoint as well. So how do you identify Mashiach? Number one, right, he has to be a descendant of King David. Now, I mentioned before that if a person does everything else, that itself could be the greatest proof that they're a descendant of King David. However, there are many, many people who know that they are a descendant of King David, and that works. B, right? The person has to be supremely pious and well-versed in Torah. By definition, this means any candidate who's not really pious or who's not well-versed in Torah simply cannot be Mashiach. The person can be very pious, but not well-versed in Torah, they're not going to be Mashiach. A person could be well-versed in Torah and not very pious, automatic dismissal, cannot be a candidate for being Mashiach. The person has to be both pious and well-versed in Torah. Number C, he has to influence the Jewish nation to follow the ways of the Torah. So we're talking about a person who has inspired millions of Jews in the ways of Torah and mitzvahs and to coming back to Torah and mitzvahs. If a person is not doing that, if a person has not been successful in influencing the majority of the Jewish people to get back to a life of Torah and mitzvahs, that's not Mashiach. As wonderful as the person is, the job of Mashiach is to influence the Jewish nations to follow the ways of the Torah and finally to wage God's battles. Now, does this mean physical war? Are we talking about airplanes and bombs and so on and so forth? Not necessarily. While it's certainly possible that Mashiach could be a leader of the Jewish people who militarily is able to defend the Jewish people against their enemies, this very much can be a spiritual war. Have you ever heard of the expression culture wars? Right? Have you heard this expression, the culture wars? There is a battle for the culture, the soul of the nation. So Mashiach is meant to be an influential spiritual leader, a Torah scholar at Tzaddik, perhaps with the capacity to lead a military, but most probably or more probable, it's a culture war, right? It's a spiritual battle. This is what Mashiach is all about. So the Rambam writes that based on Jewish tradition, this is the first stage of identifying Mashiach. If you see a person who is doing all of these things, you can presume that this person is Mashiach. Not confirm. You cannot confirm that the person is Mashiach, but you would be very justified in thinking that this person is Mashiach and supporting this person and helping this person accomplish all of these jobs in hopes that the person will be the confirmed Mashiach. So this is how you identify the potential Mashiach candidates. How do you confirm Mashiach? In gathering the Jewish people and building the Holy Temple. Now, I believe that the PowerPoint switched the order. If you look at the text of the Rambam, it says, build the third Holy Temple. So if there is a leader of the Jewish people who did the first four things, pious, well-versed in Torah, righteous tzaddik, inspired all the Jewish people to return to Torah, has either waged physical battles or spiritual battles, actually built the third Beis Hamikdash, right? It is standing on the Temple Mount. And all the Jews have returned back to the land of Israel. You can be confident that this is the real promised, prophesied Mashiach, the eternal king of the Jewish people. All right, any questions so far in this information?
Yeah, hi, Rabbi, this is Phil. I have a question about B, be supremely pious and well-versed in Torah. You mentioned that Moses, for 80 years, didn't know that he was going to be the leader of the Jewish people at the time. And so the question is, he didn't have the essence of Hashem until maybe the burning bush. But so the question is, how long does that person have to be pious and well-versed in Torah? Can they do it in a short time? Do they have to do it all their life? How do we know that?
Well, Moshe was in a little bit of a different category because Moshe was not Mashiach. Right? Moshe was Moshe and had his own journey. But when it comes to the person of Mashiach, the definition is pious and well-versed in Torah. The length that takes, I don't think is necessarily relevant, because you could have a person who's 30 years old who is pious and well-versed in Torah. You could have a person who's 80 years old who perhaps will be even more pious by the time they're 80 and more versed in Torah by the time they're 80. But I don't think that would make a person who's 80 a better candidate to be Mashiach than a person who is 30, provided that the person is pious and well-versed in Torah and is influencing the Jewish nation to follow the ways of Torah and is battling the battles of God, fighting the culture wars, so to speak, and actually builds the third temple in Jerusalem and gathers all the Jewish people. You're golden, whether the person is 30 or whether the person is 80. Did that help? I hope.
Yeah, sort of, but
I
that
mean,
was,
it's quite unrealistic to imagine that a person who is 40 years old, who never studied Torah, who is not observant, would be able to become Mashiach at the age of 41.
okay.
It would seem unlikely. At the
Sure.
age of 50, 10 years is a pretty good amount of time. A person might be able to accomplish a lot. So provided the person has achieved these levels, I don't think the amount of years is necessarily that important.
Okay.
Okay, so when you see the third temple on the Temple Mount and you have El Al tickets on your way to Israel, we know that Mashiach is here.
Quick
One of the
question.
themes, sorry, we have a question?
Sorry, yeah, Rabbi, it's Debbie, sorry.
All right, Debbie, yes.
Quick question. When the temple descends to the mount, my question is that the point when all the souls will be, redeemed back, or is that later on? Is that considered the world to, I'm just a little confused by that.
The resurrection of the dead takes
Yes.
place in a second stage of the Messianic era. I believe we're going to talk about this in next week's lesson a little bit. But
Got
the resurrection of the dead is not part of the initial stage of
Okay.
Mashiach. It's part of a later stage, a more miraculous stage.
Okay.
So if Mashiach manifests in a more gradual and natural progression, so the building of the third temple is not going to coincide with the resurrection of the dead. It'll take place, I think 40 years later from what I remember, but I could be wrong. But it would take place at a later stage.
Okay.
If the Messianic era is a miraculous stage with the temple descending from heaven, then it's quite possible that the resurrection of the dead begins right at that point as well.
Okay.
Okay, so one of the things that we talked about the belief in Mashiach is not just some time distant in the future, but you actually have to anticipate his arrival every day. Now, Mitchell, if we have to anticipate the arrival of Mashiach today, that Mashiach could come today, that means there has to be a person who is alive today, physically, in a body, who is a candidate to be Mashiach. Mitchell, could you read text number 16, please? Page 218.
Candidate in every generation. In every generation, a descendant of Judah is born who is a befitting candidate to be the Jewish Mashiach.
So in every generation, a potential Mashiach is born, including today. There has to be alive a person who fits the profile to be a potential Mashiach. Now, the world may not be ready in his lifetime, and so he will pass on a missed opportunity. That means in the past 2,000 years, there must have been, dozen, maybe a few dozen, 2 dozen. I don't know how exactly you count the generations, but certainly a few dozen people who were worthy of, who were capable of becoming Mashiach, if that generation was deemed worthy. Because of the prevalence and the prominent role that Mashiach plays in Jewish life, there are many people who have sought to identify who the person of Mashiach is. There's a whole discussion in the Talmud in text number 17. We're not going to read it now. It's a little bit long, but it is essentially many people in the Talmud saying, you know who's Mashiach? My teacher. My teacher is Mashiach. There have been many people throughout Jewish history who have identified their teacher as the person who they believe to be the person who has the most probability of being Mashiach. Now, this is what I'm saying now is people who said, if there's a person who's worthy of being Mashiach, it's my teacher. As an example, the students of the Arizal felt the Arizal is the person in his generation who could have been Mashiach. But there have been times in history where it moved past that. It moved beyond just students venerating their teacher, but there were actual attempts to recognize and to crown a person as Mashiach. Now we're going to look at two famous ones. We're going to look at, but Bar Kokhba and Shabtai Tzvi. But of course, it's critical to appreciate no redemption is considered to be underway until it checks all the halachic boxes. So that means until that Beis Hamikdash is built in Jerusalem, you can hope, you can wish, you can pray, you could think that a certain individual that you identify with as being qualified to be Mashiach is Mashiach, but he is no Mashiach until all the boxes are checked. So we're going to look at two people in history that there were attempts to more than just hope and pray, but there were attempts to essentially coronate people as the actual Mashiach. Right. Those two people are number one, Bar Kokhba, number two, Shabtai Tzvi. We're going to have a little video on the personage of Bar Kokhba.
From its inception, the Jewish nation lived with a messianic vision. Even in the worst of times, the Jews anticipated the rise of their star, a savior from the tribe of Judah who would liberate them from foreign subservience and enable religious freedom. 2,000 years ago, Rome stretched forth its mighty branches. In 6 of the Common Era, Judea, the heart of the Jewish homeland, became a Roman province. A few decades later, in the wake of the Great Jewish Revolt, the Romans destroyed the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. That marked the onset of the Jewish nation's exile and persecution. At the same time, the Jews could now anticipate their liberation through the promised Jewish Messiah. In 117 CE, Hadrian became Roman emperor. He toured the empire, erecting pagan temples and promoting Roman beliefs. When he reached ruined Jerusalem in the year 130, he ordered the city plowed over and rebuilt as a Roman city named Aelia Capitolina, with a temple to Jupiter, the chief Roman deity, erected on the site of the Holy Temple on the Temple Mount. This was more than the Jews could take, and in 132 CE, a major revolt began unlike any other. The rebels assaulted the Roman garrison stationed in Judea and succeeded in capturing and holding part of the territory. As Jews from the diaspora flocked to join the cause, Hadrian responded by sending massive reinforcements from Syria, Egypt, and Arabia, but these were similarly defeated. Rome was badly shaken. Hadrian realized the need to muster a truly enormous army in response. He summoned legions from across the globe, including his best general, Julius Severus, who was ordered to travel from Britain with 3 European legions, and units were dispatched from as far as the Danube. Nearly 1/3 of the colossal Roman army was redirected to counter the Jewish revolt. The Jewish army was led by Bar Kokhba, about whom we know precious little.
The name Bar Kokhba wasn't really the man's name. We actually know his name was Shimon Bar Kosiba, but he was called Bar Kokhba because of a biblical verse in the book of Numbers, Darach Kochav Yaakov v'kam shevet Yisrael, that a star will come forth from Jacob and a staff will arise from Israel. And this verse was understood to refer to the Messiah. As far as we know, many Jews believed that Bar Kokhba was indeed the Messiah, and that they were supporting the coming of the Messiah in participating in the revolt.
Such views were reinforced by Bar Kokhba's military gains and his liberation of Jerusalem.
What's really amazing is that during the period of Bar Kokhba's rule, he put out coins. On the back side of some of these coins was actually the words Elazar Kohen, Elazar, the high priest, apparently. And this may indicate that they tried to restart sacrifices.
Despite Bar Kokhba's widespread support, the Jewish sages were sharply divided on whether Bar Kokhba was the Messiah.
There were different views among the very important rabbis that we know from the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva was convinced that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. The Jerusalem Talmud actually records him as saying, "This is the King Messiah." At the same time, others, like Yochanan ben Torta, were convinced that he couldn't possibly be the Messiah. And he told Rabbi Akiva, "The grass will be growing on your nose," meaning you'll be in the grave before this guy will ever be a Messiah.
Eventually, the tide turned. The legions launched a campaign of systematic annihilation that left Judea almost entirely depopulated. The Roman historian Dio Cassius writes, very few of them in fact survived. 50 of their most important outposts and 985 of their villages were razed to the ground. 580,000 men were slain in the various raids and battles, and the number of those that perished by famine, disease, and fire were past finding out. Bar Kokhba withdrew into the fortress town of Beitar. It was besieged and fell in 135 CE, ending the revolt. Its occupants were slaughtered in an enormous massacre on the 9th of Aleph, the date in the Hebrew calendar on which the first and second temple had been destroyed. Bar Kokhba died there, and Hadrian bitterly oppressed the Jews and the Jewish practice in retaliation.
Some years ago, I was at a scholarly conference about the Bar Kokhba revolt, and an Israeli archaeologist mentioned they had actually already located over 500 of these villages. I imagine that by now, he probably found a lot more. So here we see that these events really occurred, and that this war and this tragedy was as great as we find in our sources.
In the ensuing 2 millennia of Jewish exile, the Jews, unlike the Romans, survived and thrived, returned and rebuilt, and continue to eagerly await the fulfillment of God's promise of redemption.
The closest that the Jewish people have come to actually having Mashiach would be the Bar Kokhba revolt, approximately 1850 to 1900 years ago. He had all of the qualities, and he was literally waging the war, right, against the enemies of the Jewish people. And Rabbi Akiva, right, from the greatest sages of the Mishnah, felt what this person is doing is messianic, right? This could be the person who's Mashiach, and therefore we must support him. We must go along with him. Unfortunately, we did not merit to have Mashiach come. Bar Kokhba was not Mashiach, and there was a tremendous massacre in Beitar, which took place on the 9th day of the month of Av, Tisha B'Av, the saddest day on the Jewish calendar, and this is one of the reasons that we fast. So Bar Kokhba could be considered a failed Mashiach, a very legitimate candidate, but ultimately he failed to be the actual Mashiach. Next, we're going to talk about Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi is not a failed Mashiach. Shabtai Tzvi is a false Mashiach. What do I mean by that? Who is Shabtai Tzvi and what's his story? So Shabtai Tzvi was born in 1626 in Izmir, Turkey. He was very handsome, very charismatic, had a beautiful voice, loved to sing in the shul, chazan, liked to lead the services. He was not a halachic authority. He was not a rabbinic authority, but he was a mystic, right? He was a mystic and engaged in all kinds of mystical practices and gathered quite the following. In 1648, he declares himself to be Mashiach. He ends up wandering from community to community. He's kind of kicked out of the city where he lived for being a bit crazy. He goes to Constantinople, he goes to Alexandria, he goes to Athens, he goes to Jerusalem. Everywhere he goes, he on the one hand picks up many followers, on the other hand, he is rejected by the rabbinic establishment. When does he really turn the tide? When he meets Nathan of Gaza. Right? Nathan of Gaza, prominent rabbi. Yes, where did he live? Gaza. Yeah, the Jewish people lived in Gaza all the way back then as well. Nathan of Gaza was the ultimate PR man. Like, he was the creator of the original Facebook, Twitter, every form of social media. Nathan of Gaza backed Shabtai Tzvi, became his promoter, promoted him all over the Jewish world, essentially said, I am the prophet, right? Heralding the coming of the Messianic era. Now, Shabtai Tzvi started doing some crazy things. Number one, he married a Torah. Yep, he actually married a Torah. A chuppah, a wedding ceremony. He is so one and in love with the Torah, he married the Torah. Number two, he started pronouncing the name of God the way it is written. The letters Yud, Hey, and Vav and Hey, we are not allowed to do that. He started pronouncing it. He eliminated the fast of the 17th of Tammuz and the fast of the 9th of Av. He started bringing some sacrifices and eating the parts of the sacrifice that are not kosher. There's certain parts of an animal that were burnt on the altar. There are certain fats, in Hebrew it's called chalev. There are certain fats, they're not kosher. Today, when a kosher animal is slaughtered, you have to have an expert rabbi to separate those fats because it's not kosher. He started eating them. So this made many rabbinic authorities suspicious, nervous, and rejected him. However, the majority followed him. The majority of people were in love with him. They felt, why is he doing all these things against the Torah? Only because he is Mashiach. Because he's Mashiach, he has the power, he has the authority, he has the spirituality to be able to even violate the Torah. So a frenzy results around him. There are Jews who start quitting their jobs, selling their property, leaving everything behind, making their way to Jerusalem. And then Shabtai Tzvi makes an announcement. He says, within a year, I am going to overthrow the Sultan of Turkey. I will take control. I will transform this nation. We are all then going up to Jerusalem as I am Mashiach. Now, I would not recommend you try something like that. Because when you say you are going to overthrow the Sultan is going to overthrow you. And in the year 1666, he is arrested. And the Sultan says, I give you a choice. Either you reject your claim of being the Messiah and you convert to Islam, or I will cut off your head. To the shock of all of his followers, Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam and lived out the last 11 years of his life as a convert to Islam. Now, while there were some holdouts that he's faking, he's biding his time, eventually he'll reveal himself as Mashiach, his conversion to Islam was absolutely devastating. It was a crushing blow because a tremendous amount, I'm talking hundreds of thousands of Jews, believed in him with everything that they had. And I don't mean a belief or a hope, I mean in selling your house and closing your business and in moving. So this was a most tragic period in Jewish history, Shabtai Tzvi, the false Mashiach, and it had repercussions for centuries. How did it happen? How could it have happened? Why would anyone have gone along with it? Very simple. In 1648, 1649, you had the Chmelnytsky massacres. Bogdan Chmelnytsky was a Cossack who led a revolt against the Polish nobility, as a result of him leading a revolt against the Polish nobility, hundreds of thousands of Jews were slaughtered. Unfortunately, the Jews are always in the middle of any conflict, and the Jewish communities of Poland, Ukraine, various areas were slaughtered mercilessly. So the Jewish people at this time period were at a physical and a spiritual low. The Jewish people were broken, they were battered, they desperately desired to believe in something, to believe in their redemption. And they found that in the charismatic, mystical person of Shabtai Tzvi. And unfortunately, so many of them were swept into it, and they placed their hope, their trust in Shabtai Tzvi, only to be let down in the most tragic fashion. Now, so many Jews believed he would imminently usher in the redemption, and of course, he failed. Now, one of the things that we do see as a result of these two incidents is that the Torah gives us a system where we are able to recognize and to identify who is the real deal and who is not. Bar Kokhba met the first requirement of presumed Mashiach, but died and was not able to be the confirmed Mashiach. Shabtai Tzvi did not meet any of the requirements, and therefore most of the rabbinic sages of his day were able to clearly identify that he's not a failed Mashiach, but absolutely a false Mashiach. And the criteria that we discussed today is the criteria that we need to look for when it comes to identifying who the person of Mashiach is going to be. So we have established how do you confirm beyond a shadow of doubt who is Mashiach when the temple is standing, the third temple is standing on the Temple Mount, and all the Jews have returned back to the land of Israel. But what happens next? What happens next? Text number 20. Irv, would you like to read text number 20? You can unmute yourself on page 223, text number 20. All right, I'm not seeing Irv on the screen. All right, Debbie, would you like to read text number 20?
Sure. Accordingly, once Mashiach has successfully influenced all humanity to serve God in unison, and the entire world will be exclusively engaged in divine pursuits, Mashiach's role as a monarch will no longer be necessary to the same degree. At that stage, his primary role will be to teach the people and direct them on the divine path, influencing them as an Nasai, leader and teacher.
So the initial role of Mashiach is to bring about the transformation of the world, right? Waging either the physical or the spiritual battles of the Jewish people, right? Returning the Jewish people to a life of Torah and mitzvahs, rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, gathering in all of the Jewish people. So the function of Mashiach is very much as a political leader, as much as he is a spiritual leader. However, once the Messianic era is fully underway, the role of being the king, the monarch, the political leader will fade, and the role of being the ultimate teacher of the Jewish people will be supreme. All right. The key point.
Lesson 5. Out of the blues. 1. Isaiah describes two options for the redemption: in its time and hastily.
Oh, sorry.
Lesson
about that.
5. Out of the blues. 1. Isaiah describes two options for the redemption: in its time and hastily. If we are meritorious, the redemption will arrive earlier and in a sudden and abrupt manner. If not, the redemption will come in its default time, and it will unfold as a gradual process. 2. Malachi prophesies that Elijah the prophet will return before the arrival of the day of God, before the coming of Mashiach. Chief among his duties will be to announce the imminence of Mashiach's arrival. 3. Mashiach will be a mortal who will possess incredible qualities and will achieve tremendous spiritual heights. On top of that, he will be exceedingly humble. The Kabbalists reveal that Mashiach's soul will embody the essence of the collective soul, the Yechida, of all of creation. 4. Maimonides outlines 2 stages in identifying Mashiach. A. Presumed Mashiach, and B. Confirmed Mashiach. A descendant of King David who is pious and versed in Torah influences the Jewish nation to follow the Torah's ways and wages God's battles is presumed to be Mashiach. If he gathers the Jews to the land of Israel and builds the 3rd holy temple, he is the confirmed Mashiach. 5. Each generation has a potential Mashiach. Throughout history, students of various influential Jewish spiritual leaders have pointed to their leader as the potential Mashiach. However, the redemption has not begun until Mashiach successfully completes the tasks of the confirmed Mashiach. 6. There have been various historical attempts at actual messianic campaigns. 2 particularly famous attempts are Bar Kokhba and Shabbatai Tzvi, with the distinction that Bar Kokhba was a failed potential Mashiach, whereas Shabbatai Tzvi was a false Mashiach. 7. At a certain point, Mashiach's role will transition or mature from king to primarily that of an inspiring teacher and religious mentor.
All right, thank you so much for joining us for lesson number 5. I hope to see you all next week for lesson number 6 as we conclude this course.